Okay, welcome to this week's Haftarah. So, like on Rosh Hashanah, there were three options for which Haftarah to think about. The first day, which is the one we're going to look at most closely. The second day, which is probably the most interesting narrative, but felt not as relevant to me at this moment. And Shabbat Chol HaMoed. All three of these Haftarot are very old. They're recorded in Masechet Megillah as to what to read. And the first day and Chol HaMoed Shabbat share a little bit of a theme. And so I thought we would focus mostly on the first day of Yom Tov, on Zechariah, and we would touch upon Chol HaMoed Shabbat. So I couldn't remember if we had ever read anything from Zechariah before. So I included just some brief notes about Zechariah. He's one of the Treasar. He's the 11th of 12. And interestingly, his writing is very well dated. So they know that it took place in the 2 years between 520 and 518 BCE during the reign of Darius the Great. He's a contemporary of Chagai. I was thinking about this week a little bit as like a sikum to our Haftarot, and I was thinking that one of the things I feel like I learned, which I think is so interesting, is that prophets have contemporaries. They have cohorts. And so Chagai and Zechariah were prophesying at the same time. And his book is 14 chapters long, which is pretty long, I think, for Treyasar. And consists of three sort of chunks. Chunk one is recalling the nation's history, sort of setting the scene. The next two chapters are the middle section, which are a question about whether the days of mourning should be kept any longer, right? Like, what do we do after the fall of Jerusalem, right? A post-exilic world. I think that's such an interesting question, right? It's hard for me to imagine, like, in 2 years you would stop mourning, but I think the mourning was a little bit more intense. And certainly the question of like when we ease mourning and how we ease it, I think feels very relevant to us.
Was that being also discussed in 48 with the establishment of the state of Israel? That Tisha B'Av was no longer needed because
yes.
now you have the state.
And in fact, there are conservative communities where they stop fasting at Mincha as like a compromise.
Yeah.
Right. So yes, I think you're right. It's a very relevant question in that way. I've heard many people say this Simchat Torah is not going to be great, but we have to find a way back to that sort of revelry of Simchat Torah in the future, right? Like, how much you mourn and for how long, I think, are certainly very good questions. And then the last section is two different prophecies of Zechariah. The first one is about God's dealing with his people, like us, at the time of Mashiach. And the second one is about the glory that awaits Bnei Israel in that Yemei HaMashiach Zman. And so that's 2 full chapters, or 3 full chapters, and we're reading the last chapter of Zechariah, which is 21 Psukim, Perek Yud Daled, chapter 14. So what I did here is I brought us the entirety of the Haftarah because I realized, as you can see, much of it is color coded. And so I thought, well, it's kind of silly to bring all these little snippets. I'll leave the whole thing here. And what I want to do is look, the blue, it talks about the earthquakes that come. The yellow talks about the light of God, and the orange is the connection to Sukkot. And so we're not going to get to the connection until the end, but that's where it belongs. I think bringing it earlier felt a little bit out of order to me. So we're not going to read the whole thing, but you can see, and I'm sorry I didn't number the psukim in English, but in Hebrew at Pasuk Daled, which is where the blue starts here, God talks about as part of the upheaval that will take place before the peace comes, right? There's some upheaval that takes place first. Part of it is going to be an earthquake. Va'amdu raglav bayom hahu al har hazetim. When God's feet stand on har hazetim, on the Mount of Olives, asher al pnei Yerushalayim mikedem, that's near Jerusalem on the east, ונקבע הר הזיתים מחצב מזרחה וימה גיא גדולה מאוד. That the Mount of Olives, Har HaZeitim, will split across from the east to the west, and one part of the mountain will shift to the north, and the other to the south, and there will be this huge gorge in its place. Umash Chati HaHar Tzafona veChatio Negba. Right, and one part shall be shift to the north, and one shifts to the south. So somehow, and it seems like this might not be a punishment per se, but sort of a natural consequence of God putting God's feet on the ground. And I don't know how I feel about that, right? I feel like I want to take to feel God's feet on the ground in like a pleasant, not earth-shaking way.
Yael, your screen is black. We don't see the text. I'm not seeing the text.
No.
I'm only seeing a black screen.
Yeah, I'm not either. It's as if it's covering up the text that's
Can you
hovering
see,
below
Judah?
it. I can see a black
Oh, shoot.
screen,
Okay,
and
hold
at the very bottom, I can see the underneath the document.
I think it's my computer right now, sadly. Let's see it. Let's try to share again. Thank you for telling me. Okay. So the idea, which I was trying to share out loud, tell me if you can see it now. Let's see.
It's setting up.
No, still nothing, right?
Double click to enter. Oh, that's something else.
There we
Can you
go.
see it now? My computer.
You're back. You're back.
Oh, okay, yay. Okay, so this blue section, which you all politely did not tell me you could not see until a little bit into it, is about God's feet standing on the mountain, which will cause the mountain to split in half. And it seems that this is not the punishment. We're going to see the punishment. And I think that it's difficult. Like, I don't want to think of God's presence on earth as destructive, right? An earthquake is destructive on some level, but it seems that that's what the text is saying. When God puts God's feet on the earth, it splits the mountains in half. But what happens, part of the importance of this earthquake is that there are two things that are going to happen. So Pasuk Daled, the first Pasuk, is about the consequence of God's presence in the world causing this earthquake. The next pasuk is going to tell us what happens. So v'nastem gay hare ki agia gai harim el atzal v'nastem ka'asher nastem mipnei harash b'yamei Uzziah melech Yehuda. So first, the valley and the hill shall be stopped up. For the valley of the hill shall reach only to Azal. It shall be stopped up as it was stopped up as a result of the earthquake in the days of King Uzziah. So it does seem like somehow there have been earthquakes before, and they want the ground to be stopped up, and the ground should be stopped up. And Ba Hashem Elohai Kol Kedoshim Imach, and God, with all the holy beings, will come to you. So something is going to happen that's going to cause this rift, and then what will happen? And we're skipping to Pasuk 8, the rest of the blue. What fresh water shall flow from Jerusalem? Perhaps one of the reasons we read about this on Sukkot, the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, the idea of fresh water flowing from Jerusalem. Chatziam el ha'am yam ha'kedmoni, v'chatziam el hayam ha'acharon. So this is some kind of connecting river, and I will admit that it seems like the geography is interesting, but I don't fully clap it myself. But that somehow this very necessary river will connect the Eastern Sea to the Western Sea, and that is something that is good for Bnei Israel. So the earthquake might seem scary, but it is going to cause this important geological shift that will allow water to flow more freely. And then skipping down one more pasuk here. Yisov kol haaretz ka'arava minegev lerimon, negev Yerushalayim v'Rama. The whole country shall become like the Arava from Givat to Rimon, south of Jerusalem. V'yashva tachteh lebishar binyamid an makom shar harishon ad shar Umigdal Hananel ad Yakveh Hamelech. What's going to happen is that, like, the tectonic plates or whatever happens, right, are going to hit each other in a way that's going to boost Yerushalayim even higher up. right, that Jerusalem will perch high up where it is, and it will be inhabited from the Sha'ar Binyamin at the site of the old gate down to the corner gate, the Sha'ar HaPanim, by the Tower of Hananel. And so it seems like the goal is to put Jerusalem like high on the hilltop, right? Like a light unto the nations, a place where everyone wants to go, where they can like raise their eyes to see. And so it seems like this earthquake is both to open up this waterway and also to elevate Jerusalem even further. And so part of this, right, is about the glory that comes from the earthquake. So I thought that was interesting, this earthquake business, because earthquakes are generally thought of to be bad, but here it seems like it's thought of to be good, and at the very least, just sort of like a natural outcome of God's presence in this earth. So I don't know how to square that with the earthquakes of today, which, right, cause a lot of tumult and destruction and death, but the earthquake is a key function of Zechariah's prophecy, right? It takes up several psukim here, and it is certainly a piece of this like end of days war. And the other little piece that I wanted to mention here, I feel like we talk a lot about light. I'm very interested in light in Tanakh, and here that or is mentioned, that will be in like a perpetual day. V'haya yom echad, it will be one continuous day. Hu yivadala Hashem lo yom v'lo laila v'haya le'et erev v'hiya or. That it will be only God knows when, of neither day nor night, and there shall be light even in the evening, at eventide. And the thought is that this light is that light of creation, that sort of pre-creation light, and that light is the light that God puts away. So next week when we read Breshit, there's like this primordial light that exists before God creates the sun and the moon and the stars. Right, when it says Vayihi Or, God has not yet created the luminaries, and so this is some special light. And it's said that God has tucked that light away, hidden it for the tzaddikim of the future. And it seems like Zechariah is saying, this is that future. This is the day when that light will be revealed again. And that light has this special divine quality that we say we can see very clearly, that you can see from one end of the earth to the other. So I think it's an interesting light that comes up here.
The second one down. That's
the yellow. So the yellow is the light. The blue is the earthquake yet again. And so now finally, then there is an uncomfortable moment. I will say I did not love this Haftarah. I was a little bit sad that it might be our last one, because I think that it is the part of the Navi that I've struggled with all year long. The way that the Navi references Edom and talks about it as Esav, the way that the Navi talks about Goyim a few weeks ago, right? The punishment of the people who war against God is this horrible flesh-eating plague that rots away their whole bodies, basically. And I understand that terrible things have to happen in war. I think we understand that more than we've ever done before. But it's not my favorite way to think about how these things will resolve themselves. But all who survive, so if you've managed to avoid this flesh-eating plague upon you, you are going to come and celebrate Sukkot. So I think that is the obvious connection to Sukkot, is the reason we read it on Sukkot. Somehow coming to Yerushalayim for Sukkot, coming on like that Aliyat HaRegel experience, is the way that the nations are showing that they accept God as God. And interestingly, another reference to rain, a sort of Sukkot theme, right? That any of the earth's communities that do not make the pilgrimage shall receive no rain. And then interestingly, they reference Egypt directly, because Egypt is a place that has a river, right? The Nile River, that allows for irrigation. They don't rely as directly on rain. And so it seems like they're saying, everyone will suffer because they have no rain if they don't come on Aliyat HaRegel, and even Egypt, who doesn't need rain, will suffer too. It's like a very, it feels like a very contemporary moment in the Navi, right? Not eternal, although I suppose Egypt needs rain or doesn't need rain as much as anyone else. But this idea that everyone should come up to Yerushalayim and they will celebrate Sukkot with us. So there is certainly a sort of an idea of universality to Sukkot, right? Pesach is this very specific, particular to Jewish experience holiday, but there are these interesting references to Sukkot being a more universal holiday. Right, we talk about the korbanot that get brought over the days of Sukkot. And there are 70 bulls, shivim parim, that are supposed to be offered over the course of the 7 days. And the Gemara asks, Keneged mi, what do they correspond to? Keneged shivim umot. Rabbi Elazar says they correspond to the 70 nations of the world. And so, and to hasten world peace, right? That there's some idea. And then on the last day of Shmini Atzeret, there's only one, par yechidi, a singular bull that is offered. Keneged Uma Yechida. So there is an idea that the nations of the world and Bnei Israel are sort of standing together but separate. And Sukkot certainly is a universal holiday in this way. And in fact, in Melachim Aleph, when the Beit HaMikdash is sanctified, the Shlomo says that right, that gam et hanochri asher lo me'amcha Yisraelhu, even those who are not a part of us will also come for the sake of your name, lama'an shemecha, that there'll be some kind of greatness of God's name, that God will everyone will recognize God. So it's not a terribly long or complicated Haftarah, right? The idea of the disaster that comes before the nations of the world coming to recognize God, and this is the end. I mean, the way that it ends is the way that the Sefer ends, right? All who sacrifice shall come and take of these sacrifices, and in that day there shall be no more traitors in the house of God, our hosts, and that's it. It's like not a very glorious end, in my opinion, to Sefer. But I think that Rav Moshe Lichtenstein helps sort of like flesh it out a little bit. So this is a very heavily excerpted section from his essay, which I hyperlinked here. It's long, but I encourage everyone to read it. But he suggests that Sefer Zechariah helps us better understand Sukkot in general. That the celebration of the festival of Sukkot in the aftermath of a war in which nature is defeated sets the festival and the sukkah itself as the opposite of nature, right? So this earthquake and the rotting of the people and the new river being sprouted up amongst, in the middle of Israel, somehow seems to say that the sukkah is not, right? You might think going outside to sit in your sukkah is about sort of becoming one with nature. But the sukkah is not a place that fits into the ordinary world of man, but rather a refuge and a haven for those times when nature cannot meet the needs of the individual or the nation. The people of Israel turned to Sukkot in the wilderness after God split the sea for them, thereby canceling ordinary natural governance. And they are about to begin 40 years of eating manna that will fall for them from heaven, right? Not natural food. Thus, the Sukkot, which are most closely identified with Israel's life in the wilderness, become the symbol for the withdrawal from the natural world into the bosom of the unique personal providence that cancels nature. So this is something that feels very contrary to the way that I have always thought about Sukkot, which is about like leaving, the safety of your home and going into nature. But it feels like Zechariah is trying to help us understand that this is not about the natural world order. It's about God upending that natural world order for us. It feels like coming out of two major hurricanes in, what was it, like a week and a half, right, in Florida, and temperatures that melt sidewalks in Oregon, and that like the natural order of things is being upended once again. And so I think Sukkot is like an interesting way of thinking about withdrawing from that, trying to sort of separate ourselves from the natural world and say, we actually operate on a different plane in some way. And then that the festival, right, does not merely constitute a world of peace and serenity in the wake of war. Although I think that is attractive today, and also an interesting idea, right? That like we come from the anxiety of the Yamim Noraim into the calm of Sukkot, or the wake of war into the peace and serenity of Sukkot, but rather the Sukkah and the festival constitute a new world order in which direct divine governance will replace the natural governance that preceded it. So I think what Rav Moshe Lichtenstein is saying is that there's a lot going on in Zechariah, more than sort of meets the eye, and that part of it is an emphasis on needing that bitachon in Hashem, that the Yemei HaMashiach will not come naturally, but with some like great being. Right, it's not as though we went out and fought a victorious war. It doesn't talk about the troops of the king going to fight the war. It talks all about the earthquake and the other things that God brings about, sort of divine providence. I think that the Shabbat Chol HaMoed Haftarah helps sort of round out this story, and these sources are just right. This is where it tells us what we read on the Shabbat Chol HaMoed of Pesach and of Sukkot. And it tells us that we read this piece of Yechezkel. And what Rashi says, he mentions what the war of Gog Magog, which might be familiar, right, a sort of famous battle, is actually the same as the one mentioned in Zechariah, Behine Yom Bo LaHashem, which is the Haftarah we read on the first day. So on the one hand, it seems like Rashi is saying, oh, well, we read them because they're sort of two sides of the same coin, right? They're both describing this war that comes at the end of days that is in Sukkot. And so if we read the war about Sukkot on Sukkot, then we might as well read the other side of the war that's described in Yechezkel. But there is an interesting question why we need two visions of the same war, right? You would think if Zechariah has covered it, why is Yechezkel covering it again? And so again, this is very long, and it is part of an even longer article, but I think he helps, Rav Lichtenstein helps sort of sharpen again, what is the point of Zechariah, by thinking about what is the point of the Chol HaMoed Haftarah. So Zechariah, right, describes the war, so our Haftarah of day one, as a war conducted against Israel by nations that oppose the Jewish people, right? National and religious aspirations. They don't want Israel to dwell securely in their land. Rather, they covet it for themselves, and they come to fight against Israel with imperialistic and aggressive geopolitical objectives. And so his prophecy, Zechariah's prophecy about their ultimate defeat, fits well within the overall aim of the book to prophesy about the process of Israel's redemption, starting with the redemption during the Second Temple period and the days of returning to Zion, and then ending with the future redemption. The emphasis that Zechariah gives to God's involvement in the nation's struggle against Israel is part of his overall approach, right? This sort of fits in well within Sefer Zechariah, but certainly when I read this, I felt, I mean, this is from a while ago, but it certainly could have been written today as well, right? Like that war feels ever renewing. And that the spotlight of Zechariah is about Yerushalayim, which is why this is specifically about Yerushalayim. And this quality, right, is reflected in that this war over Jerusalem is what is the focus of Zechariah and the focus of our Haftarah. And it's the universal component, which we talked about the parim, the shivim amim that correspond to it, that following the description I moved over here of Israel's victory over the nations who had conquered Jerusalem and destroyed it while oppressing its inhabitants, the prophet shifts his focus to the nation's response to Israel's redemption. When discussing redemption from man's perspective, a prophet will focus on the connection between God and Israel and the help that he extends to them as his chosen people. But this perspective can also bring a prophet to discuss the relationship between God and the other nations, right? It's an interesting thing. Lots of prophets talk about the other nations, but Zechariah seems to really focus on it in some way. And this perspective can help the prophet discuss the relationship between God and the other nations. If Israel is God's people and the nations fight against Israel, the relationship between God and the warring nations will become severed. This is the subject of Zechariah's prophecy, the universalistic perspective on the nation's war against Jerusalem and the relationship between them and God in the wake of the battle, right? It's not about, we've read many beautiful Haftarot about Bnei Israel returning to the land and, replanting vineyards and singing songs of joy, but this is really not about Bnei Israel at all. It's almost like we're the spectators, Rav Lichtenstein is pointing out. Zechariah is focused on what it will be like to be the nation that was at war with Israel, lost the war, and now has to come and worship at the Beit HaMikdash. It's not something that we could really imagine happening, I think, today in the same way. But Yechezkel, so on Shabbat, so that's going to be, right, experience number one. But Yechezkel, on the other hand, presents a different approach. According to him, the dramatic focus of the end of days is neither man's place in history nor the people of Israel's redemption in and of itself, but rather the sanctification of God's name in the world. And so I think that is two different ways of thinking about battles in general, right? Are we sort of externally focused on the opponent and how they will be perceived by us or by God or by the world? Or are we focused on fighting the battle in such a way that it brings sanctity to God's name? And I think that contrast, again, just feels very pertinent in this environment. And so it's interesting to think about going to shul on day one and thinking about, how do we make the nations of the world publicly admit that they will concede to God, they will concede to the people, that not only will they say they lost the war, but they'll come to the Beit HaMikdash, they'll celebrate Sukkot, they'll acknowledge God's presence, versus coming to shul 2 days later and thinking about how a war that is won is not one in which the nations will bow down to us, but in which God's name will become greater in the world. And I think that's right. That's like Dover Tzahal, the spokesperson's unit of the army, right? Is like, how do we share the stories in which God's name grows greater during war, as opposed to being diminished or forgotten during a war? And so truly, I think Rashi's comment is so perceptive to say that, okay, this is the same story about the same battle, but it's being covered by two different journalists, by two different angles, right? And we get them in such close succession over this Yantif period that I think it's an interesting contrast. So if you listen in shul or if you read them at home, to read Zechariah and Yechezkel and think about sort of the differences, I will say I prefer Yechezkel. Perhaps that's why I focused on Zechariah, to force us to look a little bit into Zechariah. But I think that they both offer us a perspective, and this is a Sukkot that does not feel like it comes at the end of a war, right? I think that would be so beautiful if things were different in the world right now, and we could say after a very hard year, we now have a Sukkot where we can feel the sanctity of God's name, and we can know that the nations of the world understand where we're coming from, but we're not there yet. This prophecy is still elusive in many ways. Us a peace and a feeling of God's love, and that this prophecy should become truer speedily in our days. That we should live to see, as Zechariah says, a time where the nations of the world understand where we're coming from. They acknowledge that our God is God, even if it is not their own God, and that we should also live at a time where God's sanctity, the Kedusha Hashem in the world, is even greater. So there we are, a Haftarah, all the Haftarahs of the year come down to this one, which again is not my favorite, which is why I'm tempted to do maybe Shmini Atzeret. I'm going to take a look at it. But I think there have been really wonderful parts of studying the Haftarot, and certainly I hope we've become better acquainted with the Navi in general, or the body of Navi, the canon of Nevi'im, and understood more of the flow of the year, because certainly that's where the Haftarah focus, rather than the content of the Parshiot, at least at the end. And I can't think of anyone I would have preferred to study Haftarah with than this lovely group. But I'm very excited to turn to Nechama Leibowitz. I think that will be a different feel, a really interesting thing to dig our teeth into. So thank you for taking this Haftarah journey with with me, all of us together. And I hope you have a good first days of Yom Tov. If you're in town and you're able, Friday night, Rav Ari is leading a Simchat Beit HaShoeva at 8 o'clock at Shul, and I think it will be lovely. There'll be food and singing and words of chizuk and Torah, and I think it will be. I'm sad I can't be there, not to be missed. And Sunday morning at Shacharit, there'll be music and singing at Hallel, and we'll try to find some of that Simchat Chag in our midst. And then I look forward to being with you, whoever is around, over the last days of Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah.
Look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much, and Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach and Shabbat Shalom, and I'll see you on Tuesday.
Thank you. It was a revelation. Thanks for opening our eyes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.